Hello Darklings! So this is the last one of my special October videos, and this time I'm talking about horror favorite actors. And these are primarily actors that either got typecast or stuck in a lot of horror films, or they ended up doing a lot of horror films over the course of their career because they liked them. Of course, there's going to be way more people that I can potentially list, so these are just some of the ones that I'd consider favorites. So of course they're going to be on this list. So the first one, kind of going back to the beginning, would be Lon Chaney Sr. So I do have a portrait of him tattooed on my leg as Eric the Phantom in Phantom of the Opera, but he was also known for films such as The Unknown and Laugh Clown Laugh and Hunchback of Notre Dame, and one of the most infamous lost films of all time, London After Midnight. Some of these are not necessarily horror, but because of his ability to transform and was dubbed the Man of a Thousand Faces, he was considered a very good antagonist for a lot of films, including the very beginnings of horror, because it wasn't exactly a thing at that time. Next one is Conrad Veidt, and he first showed up, as far as I'm aware, on my radar in one of the first horror films of all time, which is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. He also showed up in dramas and things that were similarly kind of horror, such as The Hands of Orlac and The Man Who Laughs. And then a more popular, more well-known one would be Bela Lugosi. Of course, everyone knows him from Dracula, but he also showed up in other such horror classics as The Black Cat and Frankenstein versus the Wolfman. And so he was kind of typecast pretty thoroughly, ended up working with Ed Wood in the last years of his life, and everybody knows him more for his horror roles than from anything else. Another person who was very much typecast but kind of decided to roll with it because he was okay with the paychecks was Boris Karloff. A very proper English gentleman. We all know him as Frankenstein's monster, and a good number of people also know him as the Mummy. His ability to have a lot of presence without speech is very impressive, let alone his highly distinctive voice, which a lot of people, oddly enough, were introduced to as a kid in the form of the animated version of How the Grinch Stole Christmas or The Mad Monster Party. But he worked primarily in horror films throughout his life, going up until the 60s with things such as Black Sabbath and Die Monster Die and Targets. But he was a classic English actor who also just happened to work in a lot of horror films. And then a German actor who started out doing a lot of German films before he ended up in the US would be Peter Lorre. One of the earliest films of his that I saw was M from Fritz Lang, who is a very, very brilliant director, and it's a very, very good film. I believe I've talked about it in some other videos, but he ended up working in a lot of films with a bunch of other classic horror actors with things such as The Comedy of Terrors and Tales of Terror and a bunch of these Corman Poe films in the 1950s and 60s. Another one who was very unfortunately typecast, especially because he was known for having really good comedic skills, is Dwight Frye. He mostly played a lot of supporting roles and usually Mad Men, with things such as Renfield in Dracula and Fritz in Frankenstein. Unfortunately, he died at a young age due to alcoholism, which is terrible because he was a very talented actor in the films I had seen him in, but he ended up getting typecast for the worst. Another good one, and again with the proper English gentleman bearing, would be Claude Rains. Everyone was first properly introduced to him in The Invisible Man, and then he showed up in other such classics as The Wolfman. Another great one, speaking of the Wolfman, would be Lon Chaney Jr., who ended up following in his father's footsteps, against his wishes, mind you, and ended up doing things such as The Wolfman and all of its sequels, and it seemed to pan out relatively well for him until, unfortunately, he died of alcoholism. Another one who is a giant staple in the cult and horror franchise, and I absolutely adore him, is Vincent Price. You can't have this list without Vincent Price. He was a big advocator of the horror film, from my understanding, a total gentleman, and had a very impressive presence and distinctive voice. There's all kinds of movies I could probably point to. I'd rather stick with some of my favorites, such as The Abominable Dr. Phibes, Mask of the Red Death, and The Raven. Let alone one of his last roles being Edward Scissorhands as the inventor. Another great one with one of the longest careers on this list, who unfortunately passed away last year, and I was very devastated, is Christopher Lee. Everybody should know who Christopher Lee is, and apparently an astounding number of people don't, which is incredibly disappointing. He played Dracula more than 10 times. He also was in a whole slew of other villainous roles over the course of his career, from being a Bond villain to being a villain in Lord of the Rings and the Star Wars franchises, which is pretty damn impressive. And a longtime collaborator of his, who unfortunately died in the 1980s, is Peter Cushing, who I also adore, partially because of his cheekbones and partially because of his proper English bearing. More often than not, he ended up playing the good guy to Christopher Lee's bad, but sometimes he played the bad guy too, such as Victor Frankenstein, who was kind of an amoral asshole, like the book. But he also played Van Helsing numerous times as well, and ended up being in Star Wars too. Another classic one who's a little bit less well known, unless you're a bigger horror fan, is Udo Kier. With crazy things such as Andy Warhol's Dracula and Suspiria under his belt, he's played a wide variety, and he's still kicking and still showing up in the most random films possible, usually of the horror variety. And then getting into slightly newer fare, you cannot forget Robert Englund. So even if he's not playing Freddy Krueger, which is probably his most well-known role, he has shown up in crazy things such as 2000 Maniacs, Eaten Alive, and The Phantom of the Opera, and Urban Legend. But he has long since been a favorite in horror films, and he seems to enjoy them quite thoroughly, so we should let him continue doing that. Another common one who you can remember his face sometimes a little bit more than his name is Tony Todd. Probably one of his most famous roles would be as the Candyman in Clive Barker's Candyman. Another good one is the Night of the Living Dead remake. And then speaking of the Living Dead franchise, there's Ken Foree, who is probably most well known as in his role for the original Dawn of the Dead. And then showing up in really random things such as The Devil's Rejects, but he is a longtime horror fan and collaborator as well. Speaking of The Devil's Rejects, another classic who's almost exclusively in horror films is Bill Moseley, which, I mean, if you love horror films and you love gross horror films, you probably know who he is. He's been in such classics as The Night of the Living Dead remake, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, The Devil's Carnival, The Devil's Rejects and House of a Thousand Corpses, and Repo Genetic Opera. He is a very entertaining guy, and from the brief period of time when I met him, he's very nice. Another classic one known for his campy acting and associating with Stuart Gordon a lot is Jeffrey Combs. Probably his most famous role is Herbert West in the Reanimator films, but he also has shown up in odd things such as Dagon, From Beyond, and Would You Rather. He's kind of a weird dude with a very dead fisheye kind of look to him in most of his character roles, and it kind of lends to the campy atmosphere and adds to the almost hilarity. I don't know. It seems to work pretty well for him, though. Another classic one, which you probably recognize his voice a little bit more than his face, is Brad Dourif, most commonly known as Chucky. While I'm not a big fan of the Child's Play series, they have run for 6 films and he has played Chucky every single time, so clearly they're still making money. So you have to give him a little bit of props for that. He's also had smaller roles in things such as Urban Legend. And then another one, probably the youngest one on this list, and unfortunately deceased as of this year, is Anton Yelchin. I was really sad when I heard the news for that, but he's also been in a lot of horror films in his short career with things such as the Fright Night remake, Only Lovers Left Alive, which I guess is admittedly more drama, The Green Room, which is admittedly a little bit more action, and Burying the Ex, which is admittedly a little funnier, but still very much a horror film. And then, of course, the king of camp, the king of the cult film, and known for his witty one-liners would have to be Bruce Campbell. We were, of course, introduced to him through the Evil Dead films, mostly because of the chin, and then he ended up starring in a bunch of other small, weird, campy roles, such as Surprise, Escape from LA, which I just recently watched, and just appearing in other random things such as Bubba Hotep and My Name is Bruce, let alone the revival of Evil Dead with Ash vs. Evil Dead. And then last on here, but certainly not least, and mostly known for collaborating with John Carpenter and occasionally Quentin Tarantino, is Kurt Russell. Everybody remembers him from, of course, The Thing, and then several other John Carpenter projects such as Big Trouble in Little China, Escape from New York and Escape from LA. And then with Tarantino, with things such as Death Proof. So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this list. I wonder if you have any other favorite horror regular actors. Till next time, Darklings.